Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my top 10 forgotten plots. So today's video is based off a Patreon prioritized request made by Jeremy Renfro. We're going to be looking at the largest plot lines and abandoned story ideas over the years across the various media associated with comic book fandom and the various media properties they're involved in. And in most cases, stories that were outright abandoned as things changed over time. So sit back and enjoy as we go over the biggest changes in comic book stories. Number 10. The Leader and the Incredible Hulk. At this point, it's pretty safe to declare the MCU as one of the all-time greatest and largest media properties out there. It really dwarfs everything else out there, even by Marvel standards. As much as Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Avengers are their own brand that existed long before the MCU, by now, they are all eclipsed by the size of this media property and the records it's taken at the box office. It's crazy to look back on the early Phase 1 movies, such as Iron Man, which started all of this, and The Incredible Hulk, the second movie in the MCU. It's gotten to the point that a lot of people forget or don't even realize that this movie is part of the MCU, since it features a different actor portraying Bruce Banner in the form of Edward Norton, whereas in the rest of the MCU, Banner is portrayed by Mark Ruffalo. You can hardly blame anyone for this, since most of the ideas and concepts fronted in The Incredible Hulk have largely been forgotten by now. There's a lot of interesting ideas about the leader being this new villain presented in a future sequel, and all the romance stuff built up between Bruce and Betty Brant is completely forgotten by the time the Avengers roll around. We do see some actors turn up, and in spite of what people think, Tony Stark does actually show up in The Incredible Hulk, so it's still very much a part of MCU canon, but by now all the other stuff that has to do with this movie have basically been forgotten. To be honest, I don't even think it's that bad of an idea overall. These plotlines can always be revisited at some point or another. That's a fun part of having General Ross turn up in some of the future MCU films, even though the rest of The Incredible Hulk has largely been forgotten about. We don't need everything from that movie, and it's natural that the MCU went through some growing pains in its early days, back when it had a bootstrap budget and a lot of trouble negotiating with celebrities. It's not the biggest plot that's been forgotten about over the years, but it is a relevant one worth touching on. Mostly because it's worth remembering that even in a giant thing like the MCU, there are forgotten and abandoned plots. As much as the MCU's been carefully built up and crafted over the years, introducing concepts such as the Avengers and Thanos over time, they do have mistakes and things that they have to let go of over time, stuff that didn't quite work and stuff that did. It's natural, and so it's not a big deal when other media properties and other comic book stories and superheroes from the comic books have to go through similar changes and experience similar forgotten or abandoned plots. That's important to remember as we go forward, that just because something was abandoned doesn't necessarily mean it was for the worse. I really do like Mark Ruffalo's take on the Hulk, and if making the change is what was necessary to make that happen, well, I'm not entirely against it. Edward Norton wasn't a terrible Bruce Banner either, but Mark Ruffalo really brought a certain life to that role and made him distinct from a lot of other superheroes. It is a shame though, because the leader did look like a pretty interesting villain and was something different the Hulk hadn't typically faced before. If they ever do bring him back, I will look forward to it. But I learned recently that Disney might not even have the full rights to a solo Hulk movie at this point. As part of their ongoing complicated movie rights stuff, they apparently don't have solo rights to this movie, and that's part of the reason that we haven't gotten a sequel to The Incredible Hulk. If that's true, well, it's not such a terrible thing, since the Hulk is a pretty fun character as part of the Avengers and that sort of storytelling. But it is a shame when we consider stuff like The Leader or a story really focusing entirely on the Hulk, because it seems like we're not going to get that in film form anytime soon. Nevertheless, Marvel should be applauded for finding creative ways to adapt the Hulk story into their canon, such as how they used elements of Planet Hulk and Thor Ragnarok to great effect. Number 9. Gargoyles, The Goliath Chronicles. Next up is an interesting chapter in Disney history that has to do with the show called Gargoyles that once aired on the Disney Channel. And it was an early staple of Disney's Saturday morning cartoon history. It was a very dark show that had well-written and well-rounded characters, interesting stories, and a very cool aesthetic to it that rivaled Batman the Animated Series from the same time period. I was never a fan of this personally as a kid, mostly because we didn't have regular access to the Disney Channel. And when we did occasionally get a 3 months preview of the Disney Channel, I always remember watching stuff like DuckTales more often. It was only later that I was clued into how awesome Gargoyles really is and how much it meant to a lot of people. Where the show gets interesting and becomes relevant to this list is following Season 2. After 2 very successful seasons and a strong rise in popularity, new hands took over at the Disney Channel and Gargoyles was deemed not kid-friendly enough. Co-creator and producer Greg Weisman was demoted to creative consultant, which was definitely just a placeholding position where he no longer had power over the show, and a new storyline was introduced called the Goliath Chronicles. Fans and I generally agree that this was a strong reduction in the overall quality of the show, to the extent that this fandom no longer accepts it as part of canon. The creators have even since used the comic book world to tell this story as it was meant to be told, much to the delight of fans. Since that time, there's been a lot of talk of reviving Gargoyles in some form or another, and since they actually did do the same thing with DuckTales, it might be possible this will one day happen. If not, the comics do serve as a good sort of continuation of the series, and would be a good way to do so going forward, considering now Disney owns one of the largest comic book publishing companies in the world. That might be something they would consider in the future. Number 8, Adam X and Vulcan. So here's an interesting little gem of comic book and more specifically X-Men history. For a long time there were 2 Summers brothers, Cyclops and Havoc. But the idea was floated earlier on in X-Men history that a character named Adam X would eventually be revealed as the 3rd Summers brother. It was hinted from this early time period. Mr. Sinister seemed to have known something about it and threatened Scott and his brothers, implying that there was a 3rd Summers brother out there. Fabian Nicieza, creator of important characters such as Deadpool and other major X-Men moments and characters along their history, planned to unveil Adam X-Treme as the hidden and unknown 3rd Summers brother. However, the story ultimately never came to pass. Fabian left the book before he could unveil this plotline, and it was ultimately forgotten. Flash forward 13 years later, and another writer, known as Ed Brubaker, was working on a series and decided to unveil the 3rd Summers brother for himself. In a story called X-Men Deadly Genesis, Brubaker retconned this whole 3rd Summers brother story and introduced a character named Vulcan. Brubaker reveals that Vulcan is actually part of an earlier team sent on the Krakoa mission that introduced the second wave of X-Men. Ultimately, Vulcan was part of this team that was lost and abandoned, and Professor Xavier felt so guilty about it he covered it up. While a bit of an uneven story, Deadly Genesis is very interesting and brings a big twist to some earlier X-Men comics. I do kind of like it and think it was a more interesting take on the 3rd Summers brother than the original plan involving Adam X-Treme, who's a very 90s typical looking character who uses energy blades and otherwise wasn't terribly exciting. It's an interesting example of a plot change that ultimately worked in the favor of the continuity, if you ask me. Since Vulcan and what he represented did indeed kind of shake the X-Men to their foundation. While an uneven story, it was an interesting experiment overall, and if you're going to introduce a long-lost brother, at least it added to the overall canon of X-Men in an interesting way. Number 7. Runaways and the original HIATUS. I've been a fan of the Runaways for a long time, much longer than the new TV show out there on Hulu at the moment, which, if you ask me, doesn't even really fully live up to the awesome comics done in those early days by Joss Whedon and Brian K. Vaughan, the creator of this team. Brian's run on the series in particular really stands out, but Joss Whedon also delivered some very awesome comics. But when Vaughan left for other things, and Whedon only took over for a temporary time after that, the series fell on other creators, ones that didn't necessarily do a terrible job, but weren't able to carry the series the way their legendary predecessors had before. As such, The Runaways was put on hiatus shortly after that, and there they remained for years and years. They never really officially canceled that first run, they just stopped publishing it and never really gave word about whether or not The Runaways would be returning anytime soon. And as such, a bunch of storylines were left half-realized. Most particularly, a bunch of members of the team apparently died near the end of the series, and there was no word if they would ever return or what was going to happen next. This was a deeply frustrating plotline that was either forgotten or just abandoned by Marvel, at least until recently. The Runaways did resume publication as a mini-series during the Secret Wars era, and now they're back in full as their own return series, now that the Hulu television show is being produced. That show isn't bad either. My somewhat middle-of-the-road opinion of it doesn't change the fact that it's a pretty solid introduction to this series, and why it's a fun aspect of Marvel canon. But that period of dropped content really hurt, and I'll always miss the Runaways as they originally were, since it really was a special team of characters that they haven't been able to replicate since that initial run with Vaughn and Whedon and their associated artists. This one hurt. The Runaways were never really the same after their hiatus, and I feel their characters have been often forgotten about and pushed to the side. Nevertheless, the original series as it exists is still a very special one to me, and one of the best examples of modern superhero comics in action, telling their own unique story and really selling me on some fun characters in a cool setting that was fully within the canon of the Marvel Universe. That hiatus basically lost all of that, and for a long time we never knew if it was going to return. As such, it feels like one of the bigger moments that Marvel dropped the ball in terms of an important storyline going to the side. Though I understand why it happened, and there are issues with the Runaways in the later days of the series run, it is sad when something great goes away like this, and I do still miss that first series. Number 6. Gambit is Mr. Sinister. The popular mutant character created by Chris Claremont was originally intended to be some sort of future clone as a mixed form of Cyclops and Mr. Sinister. Though the story was eventually abandoned and changed, there's lots of hints that this was originally the plan for the character. In one of the most recent writings of the X-Men by Chris Claremont, X-Men The End, featured a story where Gambit was revealed to be a clone of Cyclops and Mr. Sinister. Ultimately, this plan was abandoned for various reasons, and I think it was kind of for the best, as Chris Claremont gradually lost control over the X-Men and it was given way to successors. Though Chris Claremont did a lot of great things for this story, I think that kind of shrinks the X-Men universe in ways that aren't fun, and is a bit of a weird take on Gambit's character overall. Though it does go away to explain Gambit's iconic eyes, which are kind of similar to Mr. Sinister's, so that is a neat detail of the character. Nevertheless, like I said, this one I think is for the best, and the fact that it was eventually abandoned or forgotten or whatever was probably for the best. Number 5. Ace, Doctor Who, and the Great Hiatus. So speaking of a hiatus that really interrupted a series, there's really no comparing anything to the one Doctor Who went under. If you have somehow been living under a rock and haven't heard of this 50-year-old franchise, well, it's about a time traveler and he's an alien, and it's actually pretty good. A very interesting series both before and after its hiatus. The show ran for years and years, with 8 full incarnations of the Doctor, a character who, each time his body dies, is reborn into a new form, allowing for actors to have changed over the many decades this series has been running. And then the series was off the air for many years, with only a movie and audio productions filling in that gap, until the TV series eventually returned and is running to this day. On the whole, it's been a really fun time, and I quite enjoy the revitalized version of Doctor Who, as well as the older original series. But it's important to remember that Doctor Who didn't return with all the old plot lines intact. The series, on its revival, was basically rebooted on a whole, with the revitalized series largely ignoring most of the events from the older series. It was often used as a touchstone for bringing back old villains or certain plot lines, but by and large the new series was setting out with its own mythology and details, while leaving a lot of the plot lines that were risen at the end of the older Doctor Who series completely abandoned. As such, companions like Ace and other ideas fronted near the end of the original Doctor Who run have largely been abandoned in whole. Luckily, a neat feature of Doctor Who is that there's lots of audio plays and comics that have filled in this gap, dealing with characters like Ace and what happened to them, as the Doctor largely was pulled into an event called the Time War that serves as the backdrop for the new series. It's an interesting element of Doctor Who canon. Unlike other series, it's all pretty much part of their continuity. Anything that contradicts something else is just part of the general fluid nature of time travel. Timelines and stories get rewritten, and as such, if one thing is changed in another story, it just means that it was probably the result of time travel at some point. It's a nice way to make your story sort of continuity proof. It felt really relevant to this discussion. There's never been a greater amount of plot lines abandoned and ultimately picked up in a new form at a later date. And Doctor Who is a big franchise that now encompasses the comic book world quite nicely, and there's been lots of interesting adaptations of the different Doctor's adventures in comic books in recent years. This is one of the biggest examples out there, but I did stumble upon some other changes that did feel bigger and more significant in comic book history.
Somewhere there's danger, somewhere there's injustice, and somewhere else the tea's getting cold. Come on, Ace, we've got work to do.
Number 4. Hobgoblin Insanity. Next up is one of the biggest and most confusing aspects of Spider-Man history, the identity of the Hobgoblin. As a result of various writers and editors changing hands at the Spider-Man office over in Marvel, this identity was changed time after time. One minute the character was intended to be Ned Leeds, the next it's Roderick Kingsley. The preference for which man is ultimately the true Hobgoblin varies from person to person, depending on which writer and storyline they prefer. Me personally, I just look back on it all as a big mess. An example of changes being made to the storyline so rapidly and in such quick succession, we're left with a bunch of half-realized stories that make the Hobgoblin one of the most confusing comic book characters out there. The best thing for writers to do by now is to just pick the Hobgoblin they want to write with, and stick with that. Beyond such things, it gets very confusing, and the Hobgoblin can be fun if not done in a confusing way. When James Owsley took over as editor for the Spider-Man comics over at Marvel, things changed, and as we started to make Ned Leeds the Hobgoblin, things got really confusing as there were hints to the contrary throughout the character's history. When Peter David ultimately created a new version of the character, things only got more confusing, much to the annoyance of the original creator of the Hobgoblin, Roger Stern, who eventually managed to return Roderick Kingsley to the forefront as the Hobgoblin, and sort of writing around a various explanation for why Ned Leeds was thought to be the character. If that sounds like a lot, it's because it is, and it's way too much for a Spider-Man villain, especially because it doesn't add anything to the character in doing all of this. It just makes the villain that much more confusing, and fans that much more divided over who the true Hobgoblin should be. It's a real messy situation, and one of the reasons why I'm not the biggest fan of the Hobgoblin at this point. It just hasn't been treated well by Marvel as a character throughout the years. It doesn't help that characters like Macleod were the Hobgoblin for decades after all of this, adding to the general confusion about things. And there's 2 other Hobgoblins out there on top of that, Daniel Kingsley and Phil Urich. So it just goes on, and it just becomes too much for one character, if you ask me. Adding 4 more characters on top of that, and you get the Hobgoblin Insanity. Number 3. Monarch, Hank Hall. Next up is a very interesting story in the history of DC Comics. This is all about a story called Armageddon 2001, a series not actually published in that date, but back in 1991, introducing a tyrannical character named Monarch, and presenting the whole thing as a big mystery. And it was a real mystery, with actual hints behind it and a real answer to it. The character was eventually to be revealed as secretly having been a future version of Captain Atom. The problem is, as this series was premiering, fans were smart enough to have figured that out. When DC realized this, they did the worst thing they could have possibly done. Rather than just sort of accept that some fans would have figured out a plot twist that they had already planned out, they changed the plan for it, and revealed that Hank Hall, the hero known as the Hawk, was actually Monarch all along. This made the series incredibly unpopular, and for good reason, because it's fundamentally dishonest. When you compare it to something like Game of Thrones, which had another similar big secret to it that a lot of fans figured out online correctly, George R.R. Martin and the creators behind the TV series didn't change anything about it in spite of the fact that many thousands of people had figured it out. Because Game of Thrones has millions and millions of viewers, and a lot of them were surprised by that plot twist when it was finally revealed. The idea is that not everyone's going to have heard about what fans figure out, and if the hints were too obvious, well, that's their mistake. They should have just owned it. Because by changing it last minute, they fundamentally derailed the entire story. Especially for a mystery, you can't change things halfway through when you've provided hints that suggest that Captain Atom was supposed to be the Monarch. It's made Armageddon 2001 a bit infamous, but it's a really good example of a dropped storyline or idea being a fundamental deterrence to the overall quality of that story. And as such, it felt like one of the biggest examples of a big plot change happening within the comics and it affecting the overall story, because it essentially ruined this event as DC was creating it and made it infamous for good reason. Number 2. The Mutant Wars. So as I did research for this list, few other plotlines hit me as hard as this one did when I found out about it. I had heard some aspects of Chris Claremont's writing in the X-Men were abandoned and ultimately adapted into Excalibur, but I hadn't heard of his idea for the Mutant Wars. This refers to a big overarching storyline he had planned for the X-Men, where Professor Xavier would have died in service of the mutant cause, and Magneto would have realized the error of his ways and basically adopted Professor Xavier's dream and become the headmaster of his school, leading the X-Men into the new adventures that would happen going forward. Chris Claremont had some very interesting ideas for this story, which would have essentially pitted various factions and teams of the X-Men against one another in some sort of big conflict that would have led to the creation of the new team led by Magneto. But due to ongoing politics within the company, and at the time trendy look towards artists to drive the comic book industry, Chris Claremont ultimately left the series, and the idea was abandoned. The reason why this is such a big deal and why this ranks as the number 2 biggest drop plot of all time, and really is the biggest loss that we experienced across this top 10, is because this would have changed everything. The status quo largely remained the same and didn't change in this fundamental but important way. But if it had before the advent of the X-Men movies, then perhaps it would have influenced those, and in turn influenced what everyone thought of the X-Men entirely. We don't know that's what would have happened, but it should be noted a lot of what Chris Claremont wrote of the X-Men from his time period working with them has largely stuck. So it probably would have left an indelible mark on X-Men history. Whether or not it would have had an effect on the X-Men movies, and therefore all of X-Men media going forward, is unclear, but it is interesting to think about and imagine what could have been. While I'm perfectly happy with the content we did ultimately get, as it led to many fantastic and wonderful X-Men comics and storylines over the years, it is interesting to imagine what could have been. And the number 1 forgotten plotline, Immortus. Next up is an infamous comic, and one that I've talked about before. It's about Immortus, the son of Miss Marvel, who ultimately mind-controlled her, raped her, kidnapped her, and flew off into the sunset as the Avengers fondly looked on, apparently completely okay with this turn of events. If that all sounds strange, believe me, the original storyline is stranger, as Immortus grows out of Miss Marvel within moments, becomes a fully grown adult in moments after that, and does all this mind control stuff in the blip of a single issue, known as Avengers number 200. It's crazy to think about this big landmark anniversary issue is by far one of the lowest moments in all of Marvel Comics history. But it's there, it's totally true, and it's largely at the fault of Marvel editor Jim Shooter. This is a guy who's done a lot of very positive things for the comic book industry. I'm not really playing around when I say that. He did a lot of good work in making sure writers were fairly compensated, and he's responsible for great moments in Marvel Comics history such as Secret Wars. But he also wrote this. Whatever his intentions might be, it doesn't seem like he had any skeezy ulterior motive in regard to this stuff. He just sort of didn't really realize the horrors of what he was writing. It's no excuse. Chris Claremont, who once again shows up as a bit of a hero in this top 10, recognized this behavior for what it was and correctly called it out in his own series. Miss Marvel did eventually come to her senses, and she correctly berated the Avengers for everything that had happened under Chris Claremont's writing, and at least in some small way justice was done to the horrible thing that had happened to her character. But the crazy thing about all of this is this was not the intention of Immortus when he was originally introduced, and it's instead the result of Jim Shooter's direct meddling. The original idea behind the character was very different and likely didn't involve any of the rapey, weird overtones of the story we actually got. But as Jim Shooter took over and sort of personally steered the story in this direction, well, this becomes part of his legacy because of it. Good job, I guess? there's not much else that can be done about it. As much as I do respect Jim Shooter for the positive things he's done for the comics, he will always have also done this, and we shouldn't forget that. From the perspective of Marvel, the best thing they can do is forget it, and I don't blame them. There's no need to go back and relitigate this story. It's best left forgotten by the company. But it is part of the company's history and comic book history, and it's worth recognizing. It always feels like the most extreme of anything to me, the most insane story the Avengers, or really any superhero comic, has ever done relative to the time period it was published. It boggles my mind and suggests a sort of naivete from the people who published and created this comic on a level I just can't quite comprehend. And so, because of the extreme nature of this comic and the fact that it was an abandoned plotline, it becomes the biggest example of a plotline changing a story in a real and fundamental way. In this case, it was truly negative. Though we've touched on some positive ones, it really does overwhelm all of those in terms of the impact this changed plotline had on the overall storyline. And that's a crazy thing to think about. So that's the end of the video. If there's a lesson to be learned in this, I actually do think it's not to change your stories. As much as there are some abandoned plot lines along the lines that we've touched on in this top 10, and some good aspects of changes in the continuity that were ultimately for the better in my opinion, by and large it's usually just making the best of a bad situation, and a lot of abandoned plot lines have had to give way to some truly insane things. Meanwhile, there's a giant elephant graveyard of half-realized storylines through various series that were cancelled halfway through, that I just didn't feel like including on this list because they really don't impact anything other than their own storyline. They weren't followed up on ever again, and that's just kind of the nature of the comic book world. Because there's no commitments in terms of going for a certain amount of series length or anything like that, and a comic book series can pretty much get cancelled at any time, even halfway through a story arc, there's plenty of other abandoned plot lines along the way. If there's one you think I missed or one you think is worth talking about, feel free to share it in the comments section below. So thanks for watching, a special thanks to Jeremy for his Patreon request, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.